Good afternoon, everyone. I think everybody has connected. Welcome back to our summer school for a lecture by Professor Michele Sorice, who we are very, very happy to have with us on this first summer school in digital democracy. Professor Sorice is a professor of media studies, political participation, political sociology, and political communication at Louis University of Rome. He is the director of Center for Conflict and Participation Studies and a member of a steering committee of International PhD in Politics and of School of Journalism Massimo Baldini. His research interests are critical sociology and critical media studies. And I would love to now, without further ado, give the floor to Professor Sorice. Thank you very much.
Well, okay, so thank you, Marco Luca, for your kind presentation, and thank you for the invitation. Of course, let me say that very happy to be here, even also only virtually. I think that we will have the occasion to meet together in Rijeka in the next year or in other occasion. Anyway, thanks again for the invitation. I will try to give some ideas and some points that I consider important in the analysis of the relationship between participation, political participation, and more specifically the called democratic innovations and some constraints that are now present when we speak about democratic innovations in the modern societies. Also, the expression modern societies is a bit is full of ambiguity, as you can understand. Anyway, I go to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation. And yes, I think that you can see.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, in this first slide, a picture of Rijeka, but it's only a dream for the future, and not for now. Anyway, the title of my presentation is "Democratic Innovation and Digital Illusion in Time of Neoliberalism." So I will try to give immediately my session agenda. So it means what I will speak about. 5 points. The first will be very short, so really a short reminder about the normative definitions and the concept of quality of democracy. The second point concerns the scenario in which we live now. That means I have subdivided this scenario in 3 sub-points that are the neoliberal rationality. So not only the neoliberalism as an economic approach to life, but also as a sort of general philosophy of life, the concept and process of the depoliticization, and the very fluid and liquid concept of post-representative politics that has been stated and defined at the beginning of the second decade of this century, between 2012 and 2013, by John Keane. Third point will be more specifically the democratic innovations, and this will be the longer part of my presentation. And the last 2 points are based on the idea of the digital be an opportunity, but also a risk. And in many cases, it can be represent only an illusion. And the conclusion is a sort of dream. I don't know if it's a utopia or a possible dream, but it concerns the idea of reconnecting participation, how to reconnect participation with public administration from one side and people, organized or not, from the other side. So anyway, let's go from the first point. That is a very short reminder on normative definitions on the quality of democracy. I am sure you know this concept. Anyway, as you know, when we speak about democracy, usually we refer to some normative definitions. Normative definitions means that we don't consider democracy as it is, but as it can be. So normative definitions are in a certain way theoretical, in a of perspective, but they don't necessarily represent the state of art of a democracy. And usually in the handbooks, in the political science handbooks and political sociology, and also in the handbook on democratic innovations, you can usually find 6 or 7 different definitions, normative definitions of democracy. The first one is the liberal or representative democracy. Of course, I don't want to go further in this point or to that are, of course, and I'm sure very well known to all of you. So the liberal or representative democracy, the idea of a responsive democracy that is based on the idea of the existence of an interlocution between institutions and people, the participatory democracy that can be declined also in different ways, for example, in some aspects such as the direct democracy, even if to be honest and to be correct, participatory and direct democracy are 2 different topics and 2 different things. But in many books, you can find an overlapping between participatory and direct democracy. The deliberative democracy that is based upon the idea of deliberation, such as it has been expressed by Jürgen Habermas from one side and John Rawls from the other, until the different schools, the different families of deliberative scholars through the world. According to Stephen Elstob, for example, there are 5 different families of scholars in deliberative democracy. Anyway, the starting point is represented by Habermas and Rawls, 2 different starting points. The associational democracy and social or egalitarian democracy. Some authors also use another definition, that is that of good governance, that is based upon the idea of the efficiency of democracy, that is contested and disputed by many other scholars, because they consider the good governance not specifically a democratic topic. Anyway, I only collect all together the different normative definitions. And coming from the perspective theorized by Anthony Giddens, there is also an 8th point, that is the so-called dialogic democracy, that based upon the relationship between the idea of listening as reception and answer and action of the citizens in the common ground represented by the democratic institutions. So we have more or less 7, 6, or 8 normative definitions in general, but these different definitions can be, in a certain way, put in a hidden place if we consider a way to go beyond the normative definitions. I refer to the concept of quality of democracy as theorized by Leonardo Morlino in Democracy and Democratization, a book published in 2008, and then represent the same topics as the same topic has been represented in article and books even in 2018 and 2020. And the concept of quality of democracy is very interesting in my perspective, because it is a way to go beyond the normative definitions. It refers to democracy not as it can be, but as it studies democracy in the exact way it is at a specific and in a specific way. So we can, using this concept of quality of democracy, we can consider, we can analyze the democracy not if it is perfect or not, but simply if it is coherent with some points that we consider essential for a democratic regime, such as, for example, the rule of law, the electoral accountability, the forms of participation, the freedom to participate, the existence between political parties and different ideologies, and some other types of qualities, such as the substantial qualities, such as the social and economic equality, the egalitarian access to political life, and a very important concept that is that of responsiveness, that is a sort of the outcome of the democratic systems. So the idea of quality of democracy is not only theoretical, but is very practical because it is based on elements that we can measure. Think about, for example, the ranking considering the gender biases. And the Global Gender Gap Report published yearly, for example, is a ranking explaining the difference in the use of the gender balance in different institutions and in different countries. In my country, for example, there is a great rhetoric on gender bias and gender equality, but according to this ranking, this world ranking, Italy is in a very position, in not the last one, but very close to the last positions. It means that we have some substantial measure to understand that some aspect of democratic life are not coherent with a model of democratic life in which all the people can have right involvement and the same power to participate in political life. So for this reason, I consider quality of democracy a good concept to go beyond the normative definitions, in many cases too much theoretical. Another, and I promise to another theoretical point to consider is that regarding the different approaches to democracy in social sciences. I'm a social scientist, so I'm very committed to enforce the idea of the social science on democracy, and in particular, in many studies we have in Europe, in particular, we have 4 different approaches: a constitutional approach that concentrates on laws a regime enact concerning popular activity, that a substantial approaches focuses on the condition of life and politics, a procedural approach that is based upon the capacity of a government to determine whether a regime qualifies as democratic, and the last point, a process-oriented approach that identifies a minimal set of processes. And this last point, the typical frame in which we can put, for example, the concept of quality of democracy. So 4 general approaches to democracy in social sciences. And I only want here to give you my first bibliographic tip. That is this book of Michael Seward, Democratic Design. And Michael Seward is a very interesting scholar. This book has been published in 2021, so it's a new book, it's very recent. But Michael Seward is very famous also because he was one of the first European scholar to speak about the concept of democratic innovation. And his study on democratic innovation between 2000 and 2010 are still considered as seminal in the area of democratic innovations. So it's not for chance that Michael Seward is, in my opinion, also a point of reference to understand the relationship between the general theories on democracy and the concept and the practices on democratic kind of innovation. So I go to the second point, scenario in which I try to frame the concept and processes of democratic innovations. As I said before, this scenario is in this presentation, my presentation, subdivided into 3 points that are neoliberalism, the politicization, and the post-representative politics. So let's start with the first sub-point, the neoliberalism. I don't want here to give a lecture on neoliberalism, because as you can understand, we need not 1 hour or a half, but all the afternoon and probably also tomorrow. And so it's absolutely impossible, of course. I only want to remind you that when we speak about the neoliberalism, to be precise, we should speak about at least 3 or 4 different types of neoliberalisms, because we have at least 3 points of reference, 3 starting points that are the Wien school, in which we can, as you know, we can frame 2 of the most influential scholar of this school, that are Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek. The Freiburg school, that is usually considered the sort of the background of the so-called ordoliberalism, that is considered by many scholars one of the starting point of some economic ideas on Europe, or the modern Europe today. And the Chicago school, in which probably the most influential author is Milton. Of course, it's not the only one. There is also a point of connection among these 3 different schools, that is the Montpellierin society, that is not a secret circle, as sometimes we can read in some books, but in a sort of completist theories. So, but it's only a group of theorists and economists discussing and put their ideas. Anyway, the neoliberalism is different from the liberal approach to economy, and it is absolutely clear, and this should be clear also because in many books, many old books, we can still read that there is an overlapping between the liberal approach to economy and society and the neoliberal approach, that are, to be honest, 2 very different positions from a philosophical perspective and also from an economic one. But to the purposes of this presentation, I'm interested not, of course, in all the aspects of neoliberalism, but on some concepts that have an impact on democratic innovations, a concept that are common to the different schools, 3 or many, or probably 4 schools that we can connect the idea of neoliberalism. And this concept are that, or the idea of governance and the spin-off coming from the idea of governance, that governmentality, that is very important to understand how democratic innovation works together, nowadays. The idea of the lightweight state that has been in a certain way overcome by a new process, that is the so-called neoliberalization of the state, so the return of a heavy state, but in the frame of a neoliberal approach. And coming from Friedman and the Chicago School, a general suspect on democracy, the idea of that a democracy should be efficient, but it doesn't mean that to be efficient, it should concern and engage all the people. That is a sort of contradiction, because they consider democracy as a sort of mechanism that can work only if all the procedures are correct, and not if all the people participate in social and political life. So this is a very important point in my opinion. I want, before going further, I want to underline that when I speak about the Chicago School, I speak about the economic school, not the sociological school. Usually to my students, I say, joking a bit, that the economic Chicago school has created a lot of problem to the world, whilst the sociological school of Chicago has never done damage to the world. They also invented, in a certain way, the idea of the ethnographic research, studying, for example, how the immigrants integrate themselves in the city of Chicago and so on. So Robert Ezra Park is not responsible for the economic problems of the world, and that is the sociological school, whilst Milton Friedman probably a bit. So anyway, two different schools. I want to underline this point. So, sorry, a bit joking, but you can allow, I can be allowed by you to use also some a bit of joke sometimes. So another important point in the neoliberalism is the role of the so-called new public management. The new public management is a sort of philosophy of the administration, and it has been very a sort of trend topic in the social sciences during the 90s and the first years of the 20th. It has had a great success in Northern Europe, for example, and in US. Now the new public management is declining in Northern Europe and also US, but is still present in some areas of Southern Europe, such as Italy, for example. So it's very strange, as you know, in Italy, usually Italy is the first in fashion, in many other areas, but concerning social sciences, in many situations, it acquires modes and styles 15 or 20 years after the others. So anyway, now many public administrations are committed to the new public management, and even the official documents of some municipalities speak about the use of new public management, while all the municipalities of Northern Europe have abandoned in the meantime the idea of, anyway, the new public management is a sort of reference also for participatory processes, because it is the background of some good ideas concerning the participation of people, such as, for example, the government, and even the idea of open government as established by the famous Barack Obama's documents of 2009 about the open government, that is partly, not totally, but partly based upon the idea of the new public management. And also some projects of urban regeneration in many cities across Europe are based upon the idea of efficiency coming from the new public management. So the new public management is not only a philosophy of administration and of private enterprises, but also a sort of point of reference for some participatory processes in many experiences across Europe. And the last point to consider when we speak about this first subtopic scenario I'm trying to draw is the common sense neoliberalism, another concept that has been very largely used by different scholars, but that has been presented for the first time in the 80s, 1983, 1985, by Stuart Hall, who is one of the founding father of the Birmingham School of the Cultural Studies. And he used the expression, the term common sense neoliberalism, explaining the so-called authoritarianism of Margaret Thatcher, according to Stuart Hall. And according to Stuart Hall, in the 80s, so more than 40 years ago, this common sense neoliberalism is based upon the respect for human rights, for some human rights, and many democratic elements are absorbed very often in a framework of a depoliticized and anesthetizing rationality. So the idea of common sense liberalism is with many aspects of participation, but in a participation in which conflict disappears. And this is, for example, the risk of a concept that is called participationism, that has been used for the first time in Italy and UK, and in Italian is partecipationismo, that is a strange word, but participationism but it is the rhetoric on participation. It is a sort of trend that legitimizes the choices of the few people through formal non-inclusive processes. So the participationism is when public administrations, for example, ask people to participate, to decide nothing, or to decide the very marginal aspects of social life. A small example that I usually give. I want to give you another example that is an example coming from real life. I had an experience some years ago. Of course, I will not say the name and the political parties of the people speaking with me, but an important political actor asking me how to organize a political process, a political participatory process. And I try to explain how we can organize the process, what tools commonly used across Europe and so on, had interrupted me and said, no, I want to say how to organize a participatory process through which people legitimize what I want. That is a typical example of participationism, a rhetoric on participation, but in which people must or should legitimate what the political powers are has decided on over them. So also for in the books, the two books of Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval, two French sociologists, The New Way World on Neoliberal Society and Never Ending Nightmare, and a book published primarily in French and then in English, but I think in many other languages, by Grégoire Chamaillou, The Ungovernable Society. And Soundings is a scientific journal, and it is the journal in which you can find it's free. And if you want, I can give the article of Oshie and Stewart Toole, exactly concerning the idea of common sense neoliberalism. So if you want, I can send the article to Marco Luca so that he can spread to the participants. If you want to read, it's very short, only 12 or 15 pages. So for bibliographic tips also for this sub-point. Again, about the scenario, the second sub-point, the depoliticization process. What is a depoliticization? We can give a first very basic definition. We can define depoliticization as a sort of reducing politics to the policy dimension with a substantial marginalization, both ideological conflict and of the polity as a project community. This very simple definition is based upon the triadic dimension of politics in all the handbooks of political science. Politics as a strategic activity, that is the politics with capital letter. The policy as the strategic activity for managing and governing the territory, and the polity that is the community, the local or national or even supranational community discussing the aspect of political life. So the polity is a project community in which we can put together, for example, the media, the digital experiences, the political parties, the NGOs, organization, and the single citizens, and so on. The polity is not the same, but is very close to the Habermasian concept of public sphere. So usually this triadic dimension should be balanced. So politics, policy, and polity should be in balance. But what happens if one of these dimensions become more important than the others? That we have a bias and we have a short circuit, and it, in many cases, creates some dangerous trends, such as that of the so-called anti-politics, that is a typical experience that occurs in many democracies, many institutions, many countries across Europe, for example. I want here to remind you of the importance of the analysis of Fawcett, Flinders, and Hood on the idea of depoliticization. Their books, their articles are usually freely downloadable if you access through academic websites. So concept of anti-politics that is strongly related to that of depoliticization, and the concept of post-politics that is a more liquid concept, that is a sort of reduction of the political to the economic, that we can better display with in which we can see the shifting from the centrality of the political dimension to the centrality of the economic dimension. That is at the same time a sort of moving that is typical of the neoliberal approach from one side, and from the depoliticization processes from the other side. So, for example, think about the rhetoric on the creation of a business-friendly environment that is very present in the politicians' speeches, in many cases, in institutional discourses, in political manifestos, and also in general political agenda. The idea of the delegation of decision-making procedures to non-state or quasi-state institutions that is typical of this era of transformation of the political dimension in economic dimension, the centrality of the economic dimension, that is typical of in which politics is considered less important than in the past. Also because there is a sort of delegitimation of the political activities. Think about, for example, the crisis of political parties, of the membership in political parties, that is very present in many countries across Europe, with some exceptions. But the exceptions are very few. So, for example, the British exceptions concerning the growth of membership in some parties that has been reverted in the last few years, to be honest, is anyway an exception, because in the majority of the countries across Europe, we have been assisting to a sort of disanchorage between people and political parties. When I asked my students, is there some of you that participate in political life, in political parties? Are you members of a political party? Of course, what parties, which parties? But usually there are one or two students in class. 30 years ago, the results were the reversal, the opposite. So only one or two were considered apathetical people, and all the people were involved in political life through political parties. Now people don't refuse, of course, political life, but they leave their political engagement through other fields, such as, for example, NGOs, or the associational organization, the civic engagement, the active citizenship of the third sector organization, and so on. And they usually consider this participation to social life as political. And so it means that we have been assisting to a change of perspective that have been accompanied also this shifting from the centrality of the political dimension to that of the economic dimension. And more generally speaking, we can say that the process of depoliticization is rooted in the transformation of the government in governance. I want to be clear on this point. I support the idea of the governance, and I consider absolutely essential for a democracy to have a good governance. The problem is that in many cases, we are focused on governance without government. So it means, for example, in participatory processes across Europe, and I refer specifically to my experience in Italy, many public administrations ask people, do you want to change the color of the fences or our public gardens? That is very important. Or how do you want to organize the waste collection? That is, of course, another important aspect. But they don't ask anything about the more strategic points concerning our everyday life. So we can choose about some points concerning, for example, everyday life, but at a marginal level, at a very basic level. But we can't say anything. We can decide. We can participate to participatory processes concerning more strategical aspects of political life. So this shifting from government to governance is another typical example of the depoliticization process. The third sub-point of this scenario is the insurgence of the so-called post-representative politics. In reality, the idea of post-representative politics has its background in the idea of the post-democracy, the going beyond the tradition of democracy. And in 2003 and 2004, and this is one of the strange cases of a book published initially in Italian and then in English, but it is only Crouch in 2003 was teaching in Florence in Italy. And Post-Democracy is a book in which Colin Crouch tried to explain the process of transformations of the modern liberal and representative democracies. And he was accused to be pessimistic in his vision of life. And in a book published at the beginning of 2020, so only 2 years ago, after the crisis, the same Colin Crouch expressed the same idea, but in the preface of the book, he wrote, a lot of colleagues and scholars told me that I was too much pessimistic in my vision on democracy, and that I was wrong in my analysis. They were right, I was wrong, but because I was too much optimistic in my vision. To be so Colin Crouch, we have to consider that the process of post-democracy is not a process in course of realization. It is completely realized, and we live now in a post-democracy societies, and our societies are impossible to change. So we can only have tactical adaptation to the post-democracy, not to change post-democracy. So even a more pessimistic view on the possibility to change democracy, make These are the key concepts of post-democracy. I don't want to bore you about this concept because probably you know them. And another important point of the post-democracy concept is the idea that we are going beyond the political parties. And this is evident from the data that I've cited before. The party membership is declining in a lot of countries across the world. And at the same time, claims for new opportunities of participation without the political parties. So many empirical research, I think, about the idea think tank group in Sweden, or many other empirical research across Europe, such as the Eurobarometer and so on, have put in display the idea that people don't refuse democracy, refuse the representative ideas of democracy. They don't want the refusal of democracy. They want to participate more and in a more specialized way. But at the same time, they don't trust in political parties. So here we have a short circuit. People are no longer confident in political parties, but they are still confident in the democratic institutions. So it means that one of the problems is represented by the system as it has become now. And in this perspective, John Keane has expressed the idea of the emergence of the so-called post-representative politics. In John Keane ideas, the post-representative politics is a sort of new battleground in which the traditional relationship between citizens, executive activities to elect people, to govern territories, are not disappeared, but they are linked with other activities that put at the center of the stage the media, new and old media, the digital media, of course, and the traditional broadcast media, as new intermediary agents of the new forms of democracy. So the idea of the post-representative politics is the background also of the idea of the monarchy that is very much present in many studies of scholars across Europe in the last 10 years. And it is accompanied by another important concept that I cannot explain very as I should. That is the concept of crisis paradigm that has been expressed in the last 3-4 years by many scholars, basically British scholars, such as, for example, Aaron Davis, in a book published in 2019 on the political communication, and Philip Schlesinger in 2020 on the idea of the crisis as paradigm in the new public sphere. That is a sort also of trespassing of the old idea of public sphere, and for this reason they use the expression post-public sphere. But I don't want to put together a lot of conception, but I want to remind that it's very important to consider all the connections that are present when we out the participatory process and the participation in general. There are also other variables to consider, such as, for example, the platformization of society, a concept coming from the studies of Jose van Dijk, Thomas Poole, and Martin de Waal in a very successful book published in 2018, Platform Society, and the impact of digital capitalism on democracy that has been variously studied in many areas of media studies from one side and political from the other side, and the ongoing transformation that I cited before, the public sphere, and the insurgence of this so-called new post-public sphere, the new post-public sphere, of course, is a fluid concept, and so it's a typical artifact used by scholars to define what they have no tools to define. So let's go now to the third point. Sorry for too much words, but so democratic innovations. How do people react to the crisis of democracy? If we can speak about a crisis, and this is another controversial point. Is there a crisis of democracy or a crisis of democratic institutions? Is there a crisis of representation or a crisis of political parties that are a part of the representation, not all the social representation? So it's very difficult point, but what it is certain that is clear is that people try to react to the crisis, to the many crises present in our political democratic life. And usually there are three ways through which people react. The first is the more studied is the social apathy. People simply abandon political life. They are not interested in political life. They lose in political life, and in many cases they accept or use anti-political behavior. That is one of the risks for the liberal democratic democracy. The second way is a sort of request for a sensorial democracy or monitorial democracy, the request for stronger citizens' control over representative institutions. And it has been expressed in many ways during the last 30 years. The concept of democracy, for example, sanctioning democracy used by Nadia Urbinati, and even the idea of the direct democracy as a tool to improve, according to some political parties and even some scholars, the traditional representative democracy is, even if the direct democracy is even more traditional than the representative democracy, because it's very old. But it has been considered as a sort of new tool to make the tradition of the traditional representative democracy. And the third way is the request for new forms of political participation. And here we have some of the basic points of the democratic innovations. The increasing importance of the online participatory platforms for political activism and for mobilization, the new experiences of democratic innovations, even those connected with the new ideas of direct democracy. So why democratic innovation? So basically for three reasons. The first one is to increase people's participation. So to improve democratic participation, simply, we have more people participating to political life. In many cases, it is declined only as participation at the political elections. So a lot of tools have been used to increase participation in turnout. So think about the use, for example, of the e-voting and I-voting as a sort of trick or tool to improve, in particular, youth participation. During 2013, 14, 15 in Sweden and in many other countries of Northern Europe, there were a lot of experiments in the using of the high voting to increase youth participation, but they decided to abandon the high voting because they have no results on this point. Young people continue to not participate. So when we speak about people's participation, probably we have not to refer only to the participation through the elections, That is a very important point, but it's not the only one. The second point is to improve the efficiency of public administration. This is another typical point of the democratic innovations. The forms of democratic innovations are also used to improve the governance. And third point, to improve the quality of democracy. This is the concept I have used before. So democratic innovations can improve democratic participation in general. They can improve the governance or the governance procedures, and they can give and help to improve the government, improving the quality of democracy. When we speak about democratic innovations, we have a lot of different, and even some historical that can refer to the democratic innovations, not exactly as we consider democratic innovations now, but that are the basic background of these new experiences. Think, for example, the experience of during the 13th and 14th century, it was very interesting because they use a sort of juxtaposition of lottery and elections to create a more balanced and more transparent way to elect the leader, the doge of the city. But of course, it refers only to the 2% of the population, because only the rich people can have the right to vote and to be elected. But anyway, the system is interesting because it's a sort of new system, a new experiment in democratic life. Another experiment from the past is represented by the reform of 1328 of Florence, so 7th century ago, in which the city of Florence established for the first time in Europe the idea that it is possible to avoid the conflict of interest with this bag that is called remissi in Florentine of that period. That means the interdicted, the excluded, in which all the sorted people, the names of the sorted people were put, not because they were excluded forever, but because they were excluded temporarily, and they were excluded because they have relatives or friends having an office having institutional office, and so to avoid conflict of interest. It's very interesting because in Italy we have been discussing for 30 years about conflict of interest during the 20th and 21st century, but in Florence it was evident even seven centuries ago. We never learn from the history. This is very interesting. Anyway, again about this table of the different experiences, there are also institutional architectures that are very useful for the change in democratic systems, and it is typical of the electoral systems that can be used also to change the democratic participation. And some examples, such as the attempt to rebuild the Icelandic constitution, that has been the first example of a constitution created by people, also using social media and crowdsourcing and the online deliberation through participatory platform. Is a sort of ghost constitution because this process lasted 2 years, has been abandoned because in 2013, the change of government has had as a result the abandonment of the draft of the first constitution written through a participatory process. But it is a very interesting example because a lot of people have been participating to a process also using digital tools and in a very innovative way. So this is another example of democratic innovations. So we can here try to give a first definition, hold, even if only of 13 years ago, for democratic innovation, coming from Graham Smith studies. So democratic innovation has institutions that have been specifically designed to increase and deepen citizen participation in the political decision-making process. Well, this is a very interesting definition, but it has some problems. This definition means that we refer to democratic innovation as an institutional design, basically as institutional design, and in a top-down logic. And in many cases, a sort of neoliberal approach that is very fitting to the neoliberal rationality. The horizontality is the frame, but not the essence of this process. And even the deliberative processes are based upon are finalized, to the realization of a collaborative governance and not on a really participatory democracy. So this definition is very interesting, but at the same time, it presents some risks. These are the variables coming from the Graham Smith definitions: inclusiveness, institutionalization, popular control, legitimation, transparency, efficiency, and transferability. These are the 7 variables that are at the background of every democratic innovations according to these definitions. And these are absolutely correct, because democratic innovations is realized to increase public participation, so to improve the inclusiveness, but also in an institutionalized place. But at the same time, we have some risk. For example, when we speak about inclusiveness, what kind of inclusiveness we refer to? And when we speak about inclusiveness, we are speaking about access or participation. That are 2 different types. Access is essential to participate. It's impossible to participate without access, but we can access without participate. So, for example, in the social media, we can have, but we can say what we want, more or less, but we cannot change the algorithmic architecture of the social media. We cannot co-govern the social media. We cannot co-decide the structure and the patterns and even the affordances of the social media. So it is a typical example of the difference between access and participation. We can have access, but participation is another thing. When we speak about institutionalization, does it mean that citizens are beneficiaries of some service provided by institutions, or the protagonist of the change of political agenda? That is another important point. When we speak about popular control, what level of organization we refer to? Single people, citizen and isolated citizens, civic organizations, or political parties that are also in this case popular control. So can have political parties re-entering through the window, even if they have been pushed out through the door. So when we speak about popular control, what level of organization we refer to? And when we speak about efficiency, we consider efficiency in terms of time or in terms of accountability. That are two different things, and this is not clear in this definition. And to end, the concept of transferability, it's a very important concept, because it's very important because a democratic innovation should be ready to be transferred in other situations, in other countries, in other social context, and so on. But is there a risk of homogenization if we can use the same participatory processes in every places and in every moment? So the general question is the bottom-up experiences again. This is a paraphrasis of a very old and very famous song of Bob Seger, very anti-war song of Bob Seger, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" And concerning the war in Vietnam during the 60s. And anyway, where have the bottom-up experiences gone? This is another very important question. This table comes from the analysis of democratic innovations made and presented by a German scholar, Brigitte Geissel, in which participation at two different levels. The first one is the inclusive participation. The second one is the significant participation. The inclusive participation is that in which stakeholder and specific social groups can participate and can be involved. And this is a very important point to create a more participatory environment. But the significant participation is something more, is when people can define the agenda of the politics, the political agenda and the policy agenda in particular. It is when people can define the process of policy making. And there are two different levels. If you can easily understand, the inclusive participation is something more than the access, whilst the significant participation is the possibility to have a real popular control on the democratic processes. So it's not evident that all the democratic are based upon the significant participation. But what are the different areas of democratic innovations? There are a lot, of course. Think about the so-called mini-publics that are experiences of participation and territory. There are a lot of mini-publics, and it's almost impossible to define all the different types of mini-publics. I've tried to put together some different examples, such as the citizens' assemblies, the citizen juries, planning cell, the citizen council, polls, and so on. So, but there are really a lot of also some intersection between the different aspects of the mini-publics. So in many cases, it's even difficult to say what are the difference, for example, between the citizen assemblies and the citizen juries, even if from a theoretical point of view, there is a difference, but sometimes in the practices, this is difficult to understand. A second level is referred to the participatory budget that are very present across the world, that are usually realized and adopted at local level and urban level. They usually in the participatory budget processes, there is a vote, but this is not sure. In many cases, we can also avoid vote. The citizens' initiatives and referendum, and the citizen initiatives are a sort of interlocution between people and institution. So it's a sort of democratic innovation, but at the same time, is a sort of access and not the significant participation, using the Brigitte Geissel's terms. Think about, for example, the European Citizens Initiative. That is a very important initiative that European people have, in which we can, for example, participate, determining the agenda of the European Parliament, but at the same time, it have a lot of constraints. 7 different countries, at least a number of people voting and signing the documents. So it's not so easy. Way, it's a good tool to increase participation or increase the access. Then the collaborative governance, and of course, the digital participation that is transversal to the different areas of the democratic innovations. So when we put together the forms of engagement and the modes of participation using the bipartition in inclusive participation and significant participation made by Brigitte Geissel, and when we engagement modes, considering invitation, that is the top the top-down process, starting from public administration inviting people to participate, such it happens, for example, in government and in some aspects of open government experiences across the world, and the breaking in, the conflict, people who reclaim their space and their role of governing their territories. This different mode of engagement, when we cross together the different modes of engagement and different modes of participation, we have 4 different types of democratic innovations, starting from the lighter way of democratic innovation that are consultancy and collaborative governance, that no for chance are very, very present in many local administration across Europe. And when we put together breaking in the conflict and the significant participation, co-management of territory, that is a sort of putting together the deliberative and participatory processes with the traditional representative democracy. And that is a sort of melting together of different aspects of democracy. So in this case, the participatory democracy doesn't replace the traditional representative democracy, but it reinforces, it strengthens the representative democracy. Not for chance, it is absolutely difficult to find this aspect altogether, the co-management of territory. So considering the bottom-up perspective, we can use another definition that is a bit different, not controversial, not the opposite, comparing with that proposed by Graham Smith in 2009. Usually I hate the self-citation. So my apologies for this self-citation, but unfortunately this definition is mine. I'm sorry. And it has been presented in the Polgrave Encyclopedia of Interest Groups, Lobbying and Public Affairs. So in a sort of institutional book. So the term, in this definition, the term democratic innovation covers all procedures aiming at facilitating and increasing citizens' access and political participation, which are realized through institutions specifically designed to increase public participation, such as in the old definition of Graham Smith, and through bottom-up experiences capable of providing connections to institutional practices in policymaking and political decision-making processes. So this definition tries to put together the institutionalization of democratic innovation that is present in the Graham Smith definition with the new emergence of bottom-up processes that are very present in many experiences across the world. Think about some experiences in Latin America, for example, in Paraguay or in Uruguay and in Brazil, particularly the first participatory budget processes of Porto Alegre that was the first across the world, and some experiences across Europe. So this definition is an attempt to go beyond. Of course, it's not the final definition. Probably we will have other definitions in the next future. 4 points. I go very quickly to the conclusion. Digital or digital illusion. This is a very important point, in my opinion. Not all that glitters is gold. It's a very old way of say something that is common in European culture. And the first one is the paradox of participationism. The rhetoric and participation increase or have been increasing the importance of participation, but at the same time, it made the participant in a certain way less powerful in empower and giving more importance to the citizens. So this is a paradox. To speak about participation is important to have more participation, but at the same time, to use the rhetoric of participation has been resolved in a sort of diminishing empowerment of the people. The second problem is that democratic innovation in many cases has been resulting in a sort of anesthetization of conflict. Whilst the democratic innovation is not made to anesthetize or to avoid the conflict, but also to manage the conflict. So the goal of the democratic innovation is not to cancel, to destroy the conflict, but to make emerging all the conflicts and to manage and to create new solutions for the conflicts. But in many cases, the idea of managing of conflict has been replaced by the idea of alienating or anesthetization of conflict. That is the example that I've cited before of that politician telling me, how can I have some power to convince people to give legitimation to my ideas. Okay, but this is a very common, unfortunately, way to consider the democratic innovation. And another point is the facilitators. Then in many cases are the new technocracy of participation. The facilitators are very important because they give information, they give a plural and absolutely equal representation of positions, but they have become in the last years in many countries the new technocracy of participations. And here I want to underline the risk of the technicians of technocracy in politics. This sentence is in my opinion a sort of light in our study. Nothing is more short-sighted than the overestimation customary precisely in Germany, because the author Hans Kelsen spoke about Germany on the technical. Nothing leads more surely to the loss of the right of self-determination than the abdication of the political reason in favor of an ideal of technicality, which has been one of the most powerful ideologies of autocracy in all time. It is meaningful for Hans Kelsen, that is one of the probably the most famous political scientists of the 30s and 40s, in this famous book, Defense of Democracy, Verteidigung der Demokratie, published in 1932. 1932, so it means that 90 years ago, Hans Kelsen warned the new generation, even us, to make attention, to be careful with the use of technicians in politics, because they can guarantee efficiency is not quality of democracy, using the expression of by Leonardo Morlino. So I got to the conclusion. Digital participation. What does it mean, digital participation now? A lot of things. Think about, for example, the new political parties organization. We used three different terms, different concepts to express similar modes of political organizations. The platform party, the digital party, the network party. In some cases, it's even difficult to understand the differences between the three definitions, but they all refer to the centrality of the digital tools and the online participatory platform as a space not only for mobilization, but also for organization. That is a way in which we go beyond the tradition of political parties. But digital participation is also digital citizenship. But digital citizenship, has been declined in many different ways. The social movements have been using digital tools, and usually they use digital tools to mobilize and to create actions. The active citizenship that in many cases use also for example, the mail bombing has been the first way in which digital tools have been used by public opinion to contrast the government position or specific ideologies. The global environmental movements that are very committed to the use of digital citizenship, and the so-called digital activism that is very present in nowadays, and of course the insurgence of the platform society that I cited before, a concept expressed by Van Dijk, Jose Van Dijk, not Jan Van Dijk. There are two different scholars. They have the same name. They are both Dutch, but Jan Van and been studying similar aspects of digital. So Jan Van Dijk is a man. Jan Van Dijk is a Dutch scholar studying the network society, for example, and Jose Van Dijk is a woman, and she's the lead of a research group that have been very active in studying the insurgence of the so-called platform society. When we speak about platform society, I don't refer to the platform that you have, that you can see now in the slide. This is only a joke, of course. These are the platform that we can see in the Adriatic Sea also, and unfortunately, and these platforms are really different than the platforms expressed by Jose Van Dijk, Thomas Peul, and Martin de Waal, the three Dutch scholars. They refer to the platforms society, and they refer to the platforms as a sort of four different aspects of digital tools. So platforms as website, platforms as space for intermediations, platforms as a place for interlocution and also for e-commerce, and a platform as a space for e-democracy, for example. So for the new form of e/digital democracy. So platforms in very different meanings. How to go beyond the risk for democratic innovations? Probably we have, even in the studies, even in the research, we have to change the paradigm, also because we are living in a sort of paradigm shift. First of all, we have to consider participation as a political principle and not only as a tool. Participation is not a tool to increase participation. That is tautological. Participation is not a tool, is not only to improve the quality of the institution. Of course, it can be also this, but participation is, first of all, a political principle. It is a way in which we live in our political institution and in which we consider the improvement of democracy as a whole. And to consider participation as a political principle also mean to refer to participation in the Greek concept of participation of something that is inclusive and egalitarian, and that is a practice in which people can create a common space in which they live. This is the koinonein in antique Greek, that is a term expressing a place in which people have the possibility to share their ideas in a dialogical way. So it means that participation is not, it doesn't exist an institution in we can participate because we belong to the institution. It's the opposite. The institution exists because there are people who can participate in an inclusive way. So the old Greek idea, the Greek origin of the concept of participation, as expressed also by Aristotle, that is present in the concept of koinonein, is is the background of this new idea of participation, the participation as a political principle. And when we talk participation, it's impossible to avoid the questions concerning the commons, because it's impossible to consider participation without considering the centrality of the commons. But also on the commons, there are many different theorizations. In particular, we have three big theories on the commons. The liberal theories of the commons, such as, for example, that expressed by Elinor Ostrom, in which we have the risk of a privatization of the commons in many cases. The idea of the commons as active dimension that has been expressed by Jeremy Rifkin, for example, or in a more radical way by Hart and Negri, and the most recent idea of the commons as political principle, that I try to put at the center of my presentation, as expressed by Pierre Catardot and Christian Laval, in which commonality is considered as a sort of tool for resistance to the anti-democratic tendencies, in which the koinonein, the community who participate, is a sort of antibody to expel the virus of the anti-democratic tendencies. We are still living in a era of pandemic, so I can use this metaphor of antibody, viruses, and vaccine. So the commonality is a sort of vaccine against the risk of the anti-democratic tendencies. So the culture of common, to conclude, is that very well expressed, in my opinion, by Jardin Laval in 2015. The common is the inappropriable and cannot be the subject of a property rights. Participation, so, is the common action that constructs the political order. And this is the confirm of the idea of political participation as a political principle. So we can conclude participation is not only a tool, as I said before. We have to consider participation as a political frame. We can consider the participatory platforms also analyzing how can be more an opportunity than a risk, because yes, there are a lot of private companies controlling and owning the property of the platforms, but there are also cooperative platforms that are probably one of the possibility for common people to have voice in the new world of the public sphere. The growth, the importance of the growth of a culture of commons, that means also to go towards a care society. And this is the last bibliographic tip, the CARE manifesto published in 2020 by the CARE Collective, a group of colleagues, sociologists and political scientists and philosophers, who all together have written this very short book on the idea of the politics of interdependence that is absolutely necessary to change the paradigm of the modern society and to affirm with more decision the strong of democracy, the capacity of democracy to be the best way to give empowerment to the people. So participation is not only a political principle, but we can also consider participation as a sort of care, as a sort of tool for increased responsibility in our nowadays life as citizens in our democracies and in general in our world. So okay, I've been really long, and my apologies for this, and thank you very much for your kind attention and first of all for your patience.
Thank you very much for a great talk. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions, so we can have about 2 questions, let's say. And Dragan already raised her hand. Go ahead.
Thank you, Marco, Luca. Thank you, Professor Sorice, for such an insightful presentation. I truly enjoyed it, and There is so many questions I would like to ask, but I will ask only one in the interest of time. So my name is Dragana. I teach at University of South Florida. One of the classes that I teach is actually politics of developing areas. And I'm also interested in this question of citizenship and global inequality. So if I understand correctly, your analysis and your study is Eurocentric, more Eurocentric, because you're interested in the study of developed Western democracy, if I understand correctly. But my question is more along the lines of kind of like how or what are our responsibilities in Western developed democratic societies when it comes to reducing not just national inequalities, and you propose several different ways, but what are the responsibilities when it comes to reducing a massive inequality on a global scale? And I'm asking this question more in a context of immigration and basically people searching, moving from for economic opportunities. Based on some surveys, 13% of the world population wants actually to leave their countries. So they go to different places, including European societies, including Italy. And basically, even when they get some economic opportunities, they have subordinate political status, which is somehow tied with the question of citizenship and tied with the question about participatory democracy, quality of democracy. So could you share some opinion about possible ways to overcome these sort of challenges in European societies when it comes to immigration, but also at the time trying to address this huge problem of global inequality? Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your questions, and also for the opportunity for me to give you some punctualization about a point that I have forgotten to say. That is very important, and you're absolutely right. Many of the studies on democratic innovations are unfortunately Eurocentric. And this is one of the problems of this field of study. And they, as Eurocentric, they analyze, they have as their starting point the Western democracies, the Western representative democracies, and how they can be improved by some form of new participation. I cited only in a very quick way the case of Latin America, some cases of Latin America. I am and other colleagues have been trying to go beyond this Eurocentric perspective, also considering the Latin America and some examples of Asia, for example, because we have some examples of democratic innovations without Western democracies. So, for example, in Shanghai, in the region of Shanghai, there are a lot of examples of the use of budget, of participation in local budgets, or in many other aspects of interlocution between public administrations and citizens, in areas that we usually don't consider coherent with the Western idea of representative democracy. And one of the problems when we speak about the democratic innovation is that all our theorization are Western-centric, are Euro-Western-centric. So absolutely, I agree with you. This is a fault of our analysis. This is lack of our analysis. And for this reason, I and my research center have created 2 years but unfortunately, the pandemic has been a disaster also for this. A small network with some Latin American colleagues to expand our analysis and also to consider other different way to improve the democratic procedures and more in general the procedure of civic participation. Also because as we know, the democracy of the others are a lot of democracies, and Western model of democracy is only one, as it is and it is also minoritarian. But usually, as you know, the Eurocentric perspective is dangerous also for this reason, because we consider ourselves as the depository of the democracy. And this is very typical of our analysis. And even if I try to go beyond, even myself, I am in a certain way responsible of this misperception, because unfortunately is a Western culture, even if I try to go beyond. There is also another problem when we consider democratic innovations and in general the problem of participation in democracy. We usually don't consider, for example, the gender perspective. That is another problem that some of us have highlighted in the last 5-6 years, because there is also a gender questions on democracy, and usually we don't consider absolutely this point, because we refer to a tradition of democracy, and we keep hidden a basic point of this tradition, that is that our scholar tradition of democracy is male-centered and white male-centered. So it is absolutely full of ambiguity from a scientific perspective. So thank you very much, because this is one perspective that I wanted to cite, but I have forgotten. This is a sign of this Eurocentric perspective, and so my fault. But this is a very, very important point concerning the migrations. Yes, this is another very important problem. Not problem, because it's a problem. It's also an opportunity, and I am one of the responsible of a research network on the possibility democratic innovations to include marginal people in liminal spaces that are in many cases migrants and or people in conditions of marginality, social marginality. And we have not enough studies on this topic, but I think that we should go beyond on this analysis, and also to make some experiences how to use democratic innovations to improve of participation in marginal spaces and in liminal spaces, sorry, and for marginal people. We have had the developability of the city of Rome, of Barcelona, and Brussels in Western Europe to make experiments on this topic. I hope that they can only be the first ones, and they can be followed by many other cities, not only Western cities, not only Europeans, and also using an intersectional perspective that is still far away from the perspective of the scholar in democratic innovation studies. So thank you very much for Dragana. Yes, is it correct? Thank you very much for your questions or your interview, because it's very it's a point that I'm very committed to, but at the same time, to be really committed, I need to have colleagues not only Western-centric living in Europe.
Thank you very much. We will unfortunately have to end here since that we're already over time, unfortunately. But I really hope
My
we'll
fault.
have a no problem. It was a great talk, so I don't think that we are at a loss at all with regards to this. So, but I really hope that we will have a chance to see each other live at Zres or in Rijeka, and to have the possibility to continue discussions live, which is always somehow better from my perspective. Thank you very much, Professor Sorice,
Thank you all
for the talk, and thank you everybody for being here. And see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. So this was a little change in the program for Lucy's talk, if I'm not mispronouncing the name. Thank you. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you very much.